Okay, so you guys have sent in a ton of stuff about studying effectively.
Yeah,
So we're going to take a deep dive into that today.
that's right.
And hopefully give you some tips and tricks that you can use right away.
Exactly. Sometimes it feels like we're just putting in a lot of hours,
Yeah, just grinding away.
but not actually learning anything.
Right.
And we want to try to figure out how to be more efficient.
Exactly. So you can actually master that study time and feel confident instead of overwhelmed.
Yeah. So we've got a bunch of articles from the Open University Help Center,
Okay.
and that's what we're going to be diving into.
All right, so let's jump right in.
Yeah.
So one of the first things that they talk about is active reading,
Right.
which sounds a lot more involved than just kind of like letting your eyes glaze over the page.
Yeah. It's definitely not just about, passively looking at the words.
Wow.
It's about actually engaging with the material,
Okay.
thinking about what you're reading and figuring out how it's relevant to you.
So it's kind of like reading with a purpose.
Exactly. And the articles really emphasize that passive rereading is not very effective.
Yeah, it can be a real time suck.
It is. You end up spending a lot of time but not really retaining the information.
Okay, so how do we actually make that shift then from passive to active reading?
Well, there are a bunch of techniques that we can use.
Lay them on us.
All right, so one thing that comes up is highlighting and underlining.
Yeah, I do that all the time, but I feel like sometimes I end up highlighting everything.
Right, and that's a common mistake.
Yeah.
You want to be selective with your highlighting.
Okay.
Use it to emphasize the most important keywords and phrases.
So kind of like a spotlight, not a floodlight.
Exactly. If everything is highlighted, nothing stands out.
Right, that makes sense.
You want those highlighted sections to act as memory triggers later on.
Okay, cool.
Another really useful technique is making annotations.
What does that mean?
Annotations are basically little notes that you jot down in the margins.
Oh, we're
They can be summaries of key points, questions that come to mind, even challenges to the author's ideas.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're really interacting with the text.
Exactly. And this forces you to think critically about the material,
Okay,
which leads to deeper understanding and better memory retention.
that makes sense.
And if you're working with a book that you can't write in,
Right, like a library book or something?
exactly, you can always use sticky notes.
Good idea.
They serve the same purpose.
Okay, so we're not just highlighting, we're asking questions, challenging ideas.
Right. Active reading is all about engaging with the material on multiple levels.
So what kind of questions should we be asking?
Well, the articles suggest thinking about things like who is the author
Okay.
and what is their perspective, when was this written, who is the intended audience.
Interesting.
You can also ask yourself how this information connects to other things you're studying
Okay.
or what the author's purpose was in writing this.
So it's kind of like being a detective?
In a way, yes, you're trying to uncover the deeper meaning and context of the text.
Like that.
And then there's self-testing.
Okay, what's that?
So basically, you read a section of material for, let's say, 20 or 30 minutes.
Okay.
And then without looking back, you try to recall the main points from memory.
Oh, wow. So you're really putting yourself to the test.
Exactly. And then you go back and check your recall.
Okay.
And this helps you to identify any gaps in your understanding.
So it's not just about checking what you remember, it's about reinforcing the material.
Exactly. And this active retrieval process is much more effective than passive rereading.
Okay, so self-testing is a good one.
Yeah, and there's this other thing they talk about called signposts.
Signposts.
Yeah, so these are like little clues that the author uses to guide you through the text.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
So phrases like, most importantly, or crucially, these signal that something really important is coming up.
Okay.
Or phrases like, in contrast, or on the other hand, these indicate a shift in perspective.
Interesting. So they're like little road signs in the text.
Exactly. They help you to follow the author's argument and understand what they're emphasizing.
That's really helpful because sometimes I feel like I get lost in the details.
Yeah, recognizing the signposts can make a huge difference.
Okay.
And then there's this idea of explaining what you've read to someone else.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah, so even if you're just talking to yourself or an empty room,
Talking to the dog.
exactly, articulating your understanding out loud can be super helpful.
How so?
It forces you to process the information and put it into your own words,
Right.
which really solidifies your grasp of the material.
And it helps you to figure out if there's anything you don't quite understand.
Exactly. Any gaps in your knowledge will become very apparent.
Okay. I'm definitely going to try that one.
Yeah, and for those of us who are always on the go,
Right. Always busy.
The articles suggest recording your notes or even the study material itself.
And then listening back to it later.
Exactly. You can turn your commute or your workout into valuable study time.
That's a great idea because I feel like I waste so much time just listening to music.
Right. This way you can multitask and make the most of your time.
I like it.
Okay, so moving on, one of the articles talks about a specific method called SQ3R.
SQ3R. That sounds intense.
It's actually not that complicated once you break it down.
Okay, so break it down for me.
SQ3R stands for Skim Question, Read, Remember, and Review.
All right, so 5 steps.
Yep, and they're all designed to help you engage with the material more effectively.
Okay, let's start with skim. What does that involve?
So skimming is basically just quickly surveying the material.
So you're not reading every word?
No, you're just trying to get a general overview.
Okay.
So you look at the title, the headings, subheadings, any visuals,
Okay.
and maybe read the introduction and conclusion.
So you're getting a sense of the structure and the main topics.
Exactly. And this helps you to focus your attention when you start reading in detail.
Makes sense. What about question?
So this is where you start thinking about your purpose for reading.
Okay.
And you formulate questions based on that purpose.
So if I'm reading for an assignment, I might ask myself, how does this text relate to the assignment questions?
Exactly. And you can also generate general questions about the topic itself.
Okay.
Like who, what, where, when, why.
So you're setting an agenda for your reading.
Exactly. You're actively engaging with the material before you even start reading.
I like that.
Okay, so then comes read.
And I assume this is where we actually read the text.
Yes, but you're not just passively reading anymore.
Right.
You're actively looking for answers to the questions you formulated in the previous step.
Okay.
And you're trying to understand the author's arguments and main points.
Got it. What about remember?
Remember is basically like self-testing.
Okay.
After you've read a section, you try to recall the key information from memory.
Without looking back at the text.
Exactly. And this helps to solidify your learning.
Okay. And finally, review.
Review is where you go back and reread sections that you found confusing.
Okay.
And you take notes in your own words.
So you're really making sure that you understand the material.
Exactly. And you're creating a resource that you can refer back to later.
That's a great system.
It is, and it can really make a difference in your understanding and retention.
Okay, so we've talked about active reading.
Yeah,
But the articles also emphasize efficiency.
right. Being efficient with your reading is crucial.
Especially when we have limited time.
Exactly. So one of the key things they talk about is knowing why you're reading something.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Are you reading for an assignment, for an exam, for general knowledge?
Right. Your purpose will shape how you approach the text.
Exactly. And if you have specific questions or focus areas in mind,
Like from the assignment or the exam.
yeah, keep those in front of you while you're reading.
So you can stay focused.
Exactly. And another good tip is to quickly scan the material before you start reading in detail.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
It can really save you time.
So what are you looking for when you're scanning?
You want to look at the table of contents, the headings, subheadings, any visuals?
Okay.
Maybe read this introduction and conclusion.
So you're basically getting a roadmap of the material.
Exactly. You want to see how it's structured and identify the sections that are most relevant to you.
So you're not wasting time on stuff you don't need.
Right. And once you've done that, you can settle in for a more thorough read.
And what are some tips for being efficient during that thorough read?
Well, all those active reading techniques we talked about are really helpful.
Like note-taking, highlighting, annotating.
Exactly. And pay attention to the text's structure.
No.
Look at how the author uses headings, subheadings, opening and closing paragraphs.
And those signposts we talked about.
Exactly. All of that helps you to understand the flow of information.
Right, and it's important to focus on understanding, not just memorizing.
Yeah. You want to engage with the material critically.
And don't be afraid to compare it to other sources.
Absolutely. That can really deepen your understanding.
And what about when you're doing exercises or activities in your study materials?
Good point. The articles suggest making a brief note of what you did.
Oh, that's a good idea.
It can save you time later when you're studying for an exam or writing an assignment.
Because you won't have to repeat the work.
Exactly. And another simple but important tip is to keep a dictionary or glossary handy.
Yeah, that's essential.
You don't want to get bogged down by unfamiliar words or concepts.
Right, they can really interrupt your flow.
And speaking of flow, what about rereading?
Yeah, we often have to reread stuff.
We do, and there are ways to do it efficiently.
Okay, tell me more.
If you're rereading for a specific purpose, like to find information for an assignment,
Yeah.
you can scan the text for keywords and focus on the notes you've already taken.
So you don't have to read the whole thing again.
Exactly, and be flexible with your reading speed.
Okay.
Sometimes you can skim, sometimes you need to slow down and really absorb the details.
And what about when we encounter material that we find boring or frustrating?
Yeah,
How do we stay efficient and motivated in those situations?
Well, the advice is to try and engage with the material on a more critical level.
Okay.
Ask yourself why you find it boring or frustrating. Maybe there's something about the author's writing style or the topic itself.
Right.
Or maybe it's just not connecting with your current interests.
And then what?
Once you've identified the source of your resistance, try to find a way to make the material more relevant to you.
Okay.
Maybe you can connect it to something you're passionate about or find a different perspective on it.
So you're turning a negative into a positive.
Exactly. And sometimes just discussing it with other students can help.
Yeah, hearing someone else's take on it can be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about active reading and efficient reading.
Yeah.
What about fast reading techniques?
Like scanning and skimming.
Yeah, the articles mention those briefly.
So scanning is really useful when you need to locate specific information quickly.
Like a keyword or a phrase.
Exactly. Or you might scan to get a sense of how the text is laid out.
Okay.
Skimming is more about getting a general understanding of the content.
So you can decide if it's worth reading in more detail.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Let's move on to note-taking.
Right, note-taking is super important.
The articles really emphasize that.
It is. It's a crucial part of active learning.
So why is it so important?
Well, when you take notes, you're forced to process the information.
Okay.
You have to identify the key concepts and pull them into your own words. And that process of active engagement leads to much better retention.
Compared to just passive reading.
Exactly. And good notes are also a valuable resource for later study and revision.
So it's not just about scribbling down everything you hear or read?
No, it's about being selective and strategic.
The articles talk about a two-stage approach to note-taking.
Yeah, so the first stage is about capturing the main points as you go.
Okay.
These initial notes might be quite detailed.
And then what?
And then the second stage is about summarizing, condensing, and organizing those notes.
So you're creating a more concise and structured set of notes.
Exactly, and you might use different techniques for this, like highlighting bullet points, mind maps.
Okay.
The key is to find what works best for you.
Right, so it's personalized?
Exactly, and before you even start taking notes, think about your learning goals.
Okay.
The assignment requirements and your own learning style.
That makes sense.
Those factors will influence the best approach for you.
What if you're in a lecture and you're given a handout?
Then use the handout as a framework for your notes. The instructor has probably designed it to highlight key information.
So you can just add your own annotations.
Exactly.
And it's important to revisit your notes regularly, right?
Absolutely. It reinforces your understanding and helps you prepare for assignments and exams.
And it helps you make connections between different ideas.
Exactly. You want to see the bigger picture.
So what are some common mistakes people make when taking notes?
Well, one big one is trying to write down everything.
Yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that.
It's tempting, but it's not effective.
Right. You end up with pages of notes, but you don't actually absorb the information.
Exactly. You want to focus on the key ideas, not the every word.
Okay, what else?
Don't get flustered if you miss something.
Yeah, that happens sometime.
Just make a note of it and come back to it later.
Good advice.
And remember that your notes are for you.
Right?
They don't have to make sense to anyone else.
So use whatever abbreviations or shorthand works for you.
Exactly. And don't try to remember everything in real time.
That's overwhelming.
It is. You can always go back and review the material later.
Okay, good to know. What else?
Well, it's important to organize your notes systematically.
So you can easily find what you need.
Exactly. And don't forget to note down your sources.
Like page numbers or website URLs?
Yeah, that's crucial for citations and avoiding plagiarism.
Right, and experiment with different note-taking methods.
Yeah, find what works best for you.
Bullet points, mind maps, color coding.
Exactly.
And don't take notes constantly.
Right. Allow yourself time to think and participate in discussions.
Without the pressure of writing everything down.
Exactly.
Right.
And a really important tip is to try and rephrase difficult ideas in your own words.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
It's a great way to check your understanding.
If you can explain it in your own words, then you probably get it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
But there's one more thing we need to talk about.
And that is?
The study environment.
Right. The physical space where you study can have a big impact on your focus and productivity.
So what are the key elements of a good study environment?
Well, first and foremost, you need a quiet space, free from distractions.
No TV, no music, no social media.
Exactly. You want to minimize any external stimuli that could compete for your attention.
And it should be a comfortable space
Yeah, you want to be able to sit or stand comfortably for extended periods.
without getting achy or restless.
Right, and the articles also suggest studying in short bursts.
Like 15 or 20 minutes at a time.
Exactly, take breaks to stretch, move around, or switch to a different task.
So you don't get mentally fatigued.
Right, and during those study sessions, pause periodically to check your understanding
Okay.
and revisit any sections that you found challenging.
So you're actively engaging with the material.
Exactly, and don't be afraid to reach out to other students for help.
Like in online forums or study groups.
Yeah, sometimes discussing a difficult concept with someone else can make all the difference.
So to sum up, what would you say is the most important takeaway from all of this?
The key message is that effective studying is about being active and strategic.
Right. It's not just about passively absorbing information.
Exactly. You need to engage with the material, think critically about it, and apply what you've learned.
And that's what leads to those aha moments.
It is when you suddenly understand something in a new and deeper way.
Yeah, those are the best.
They are, and they make all the effort worthwhile.
So here's a challenge for you.
Okay, I'm listening.
Pick one or two of the techniques we've talked about today
Okay,
and try incorporating them into your study routine.
I like it.
Maybe start with annotations or the two-stage approach to note-taking
Good choices.
and see how it impacts your understanding and your confidence.
I think you'll be surprised at the difference it makes.
Me too.
It's
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
been a pleasure.
And happy studying.
Yeah, good luck out there.